Her voice provided the elegant, romantic soundtrack for millions of weddings. But the woman standing behind the microphone was trapped in a living nightmare. She was Etta James, the undeniable powerhouse who sweetened the gritty masculine roar of Chicago blues to conquer the mainstream pop market. Yet, beneath the glamorous gowns and lush orchestral arrangements lay a harrowing reality of violent abuse, systemic financial theft, and a devastating heroin addiction. Record executives deliberately packaged the raw trauma of an abandoned child into a polite, digestible product, locking her inside a ruthless economic cage. They tried to drown her agony under a layer of sweet, classical strings, but she weaponized her uncompromising rage into an immortal, defiant roar. The story begins in Los Angeles in 1938, in a world that offered zero margins for error for a young black girl. She was born Etta Hawkins to a mother, Dorothy, who was only 14 years old at the time. Dorothy was a transient, chaotic figure, a woman who treated motherhood as an inconvenient interruption to a life of street-level survival and fleeting romances. She abandoned Etta almost immediately, leaving the infant in the care of a rotating cast of landladies and strict foster parents. From her first cognitive moments, Etta learned the most damaging psychological lesson a child can absorb. She was unwanted. This primal wound of abandonment was compounded by a deep, unsettling crisis of identity. Etta was notably light-skinned, a physical trait that alienated her from her peers in the segregated black neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The source of this complexion was a phantom. The persistent, highly credible rumor throughout her life was that her biological father was Rudolph Wanderone, the legendary flamboyant white pool hustler known to the world as Minnesota Fats. Wanderone never publicly acknowledged her, and the absence of a father figure created a massive emotional void. Etta did not know exactly who she was or where she belonged. She was a mixed-race child in a racially divided America, discarded by her teenage mother, and ignored by her famous wealthy white father. This profound alienation calcified into a hardened defensive rage. If the world was going to reject her, she would learn to attack it first. Her first arena for this attack was the church. In the 1940s, for the black community, the church was the absolute center of social and spiritual life. But for a child prodigy, it was also a grueling, unforgiving training ground. By the age of 5, Etta's freakishly powerful voice was discovered by Professor James Earl Hines, the musical director of the St. Paul Baptist Church. Hines was a brilliant choir master, but he was also a ruthless disciplinarian who viewed the child's vocal cords as a raw material to be extracted by any means necessary. Hines demanded that the 5-year-old girl sing from her diaphragm, producing a booming, adult-sized sound that could cut through the massive church choir. When she failed to project loudly enough, Hines would step forward and punch the small child hard in the stomach. He physically battered the breath out of her lungs to force her to push the notes out with maximum velocity. The congregation praised the miraculous, booming voice of the little girl, entirely blind to the physical abuse generating it. This was the brutal reality of early black entertainment. The system, even within the supposed sanctuary of the church, treated black talent as a commodity to be forcefully mined. Hines's abuse inadvertently forged Etta's signature sound, a robust, feral contralto that possessed the gravel of a grown woman. But more tragically, it hardwired her brain to accept a devastating dynamic. Physical pain and authoritative abuse were simply the necessary currencies required to receive attention and applause. She learned to associate violence with love, a psychological trap that would dictate her disastrous relationships with men and the music industry for the rest of her life. By 1952, the teenage Etta had relocated to San Francisco. She was a juvenile delinquent, running the streets, skipping school, and singing in gritty doo-wop groups to survive. She was 14 years old, tough, street-smart, and fiercely ambitious. She formed a vocal trio called the Creolettes and managed to bluff her way into the hotel room of Johnny Otis, a highly influential bandleader and talent scout. Otis was a shrewd operator who immediately recognized that the teenager standing in front of him possessed a vocal power that completely defied her age. Otis took control. He flipped her first name, Etta, to create the punchy, commercial moniker Etta James. He renamed her backing group the Peaches. In 1954, he took the 14-year-old into a recording studio to cut an answer record to Hank Ballard's highly suggestive, chart-topping R&B hit Work With Me, Annie. The track Etta recorded was called Roll With Me, Henry. The song was an immediate, explosive sensation. However, the lyrics were dripping with explicit sexual innuendo, a shocking boundary to push for a black female teenager in the conservative climate of the 1950s. White radio stations initially banned it. To circumvent the censorship, the record label sanitized the title to The Wallflower. The track skyrocketed to #1 on the Billboard R&B charts in 1955. Etta James was a star before she was old enough to legally drive a car, but a hit record in the 1950s independent music scene did not equal wealth. It equated to indentured servitude. Etta was signed to Modern Records, a label notorious for its ruthless business practices. With a #1 hit to her name, the 15-year-old was shoved onto a tour bus and thrust into the grueling reality of the Chitlin Circuit. The Chitlin Circuit was a network of segregated venues, juke joints, and theaters across the United States where black entertainers were allowed to perform. It was a punishing, dangerous existence. Etta traveled thousands of miles on unheated buses, playing 2 or 3 shows, a night in mob-run clubs where violence was a casual occurrence. She was navigating the Jim Crow South, facing the constant mortal threat of racial terror, while simultaneously dodging the predatory advances of older male musicians and club promoters. The economic exploitation was absolute. Modern Records owned her publishing. They owned her master recordings. Like countless black artists of the era, Etta had no legal representation and no understanding of mechanical royalties. The label handed her small, sporadic cash allowances to buy stage dresses or food, while quietly pocketing the massive profits generated by the hundreds of thousands of records she was selling. She was working herself to the bone, entertaining massive crowds every night, yet she owned absolutely nothing. The young girl who had been punched in the stomach to produce a sound was now being economically battered by an industry that viewed her as disposable labor. Surrounded by violent men, exhausted by the road, and alienated from a mother who only appeared when there was money to be extracted, Etta James was rapidly hardening into a cynic. The sweet, upbeat tempo of The Wallflower masked the reality of a teenager who was being eaten alive by the road. She was surviving on sheer, aggressive willpower, but her career was stalling. The novelty of the teenage R&B star was wearing off as the 1950s drew to a close. Etta James needed a rescue, a transformation, and a platform that could elevate her from the smoky, dangerous clubs of the Chitlin Circuit to the grand stages of mainstream America. She was about to find it in the cold, snowy industrial capital of Chicago, inside the heavy doors of a company called Chess Records. The first decade of Etta James's life was a masterclass in survival. The system, from the absentee parents, to the abusive choir master, to the predatory record executives at Modern Records, had taught her that she was on her own. Every ounce of her success had been paid for in blood, sweat, and stolen royalties. But the trauma had not broken her. It had armed her. Her voice was no longer just a biological function. It was a weapon loaded with years of suppressed rage and agonizing loneliness. As she prepared to step into the 1960s, Etta James was done being a teenage novelty act. She was ready to demand her crown. But to claim it, she would have to step into the den of Leonard Chess, a man who offered her the world, only to lock the financial chains even tighter around her ankles. The year 1960 marked a profound tectonic shift in the landscape of American popular music, and at the absolute epicenter of this earthquake stood the industrial, snow-covered city of Chicago. Chess Records, the legendary label founded by immigrant brothers Leonard and Phil Chess, had built an empire on the ferocious, masculine energy of electric blues. They had recorded the foundational pillars of the genre, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and Little Walter, capturing the harsh, unvarnished sound of the black migration from the rural South to the urban North. But Leonard Chess was, above all else, a fiercely pragmatic businessman. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, he stared at the financial ledgers and recognized a cold, immovable ceiling. The raw, aggressive blues of his primary roster was largely confined to segregated rhythm and blues radio stations. To generate truly monumental, generational wealth, Chess Records needed to cross over. They needed to breach the fortress of the white, middle-class pop market. To do this, Leonard Chess required a Trojan horse. He found it in a 22-year-old woman whose voice contained the gravel of the streets, but whose ambition reached for the sophistication of high society. He found Etta James. The introduction was facilitated by Bobby Lester, a vocalist for the Moonglows, who recognized that Etta was stagnating on the grueling Chitlin circuit. When Etta walked into the Chess Records offices, she was technically a young woman, but psychologically, she was a battered veteran of a deeply predatory industry. She was exhausted by the juvenile, suggestive novelty hits that had defined her teenage years at Modern Records. She vehemently despised being pigeonholed as a mere R&B belter. Etta wanted dignity. She harbored a deep, abiding desire to sing jazz standards, elegant pop, and mature ballads. She wanted to stand on the grand stages of upscale theaters, bathed in a spotlight, wearing a glamorous gown, commanding the quiet, respectful attention of a sophisticated audience. It was a profound psychological reaction to the chaos of her childhood. The abandoned, mixed-race girl who had been punched in the stomach to sing gospel now sought validation through the refined aesthetics of classical orchestration. Leonard Chess immediately saw the utility of her ambition. He signed her to Argo, a subsidiary label of Chess Records, specifically designed to target the jazz and pop markets. But Chess knew that to sell a black female artist with a tough, street-hardened reputation to conservative white America, he could not simply put her in front of a standard blues rhythm section. He had to execute a highly calculated, socio-economic musical strategy. In the industry, this production technique was known as the sweetening. To implement this strategy, Chess hired Riley Hampton, a brilliant, formally trained arranger and conductor. Hampton's mandate was to take the raw, feral power of Etta James and wrap it in a layer of absolute luxury. The sweetening involved the extensive use of sweeping, European-style string sections, violins, violas, and cellos, playing lush, meticulously charted arrangements. Historically, the music industry believed that white, middle-class audiences were intimidated by the overt, aggressive sexuality and the stark, painful realism of the blues. The strings acted as an auditory pacifier. They provided a polite, velvet backdrop that signaled safety and sophistication to the mainstream pop consumer. However, the resulting artistic triumph of Etta James's Argo recordings did not stem from her assimilation into this polite sound. It stemmed from her absolute refusal to be subdued by it. When placed in front of Riley Hampton's elegant, cascading string sections, Etta did not soften her vocal attack. She did not adopt the breathy, restrained delivery of traditional pop singers. Instead, she unleashed the full, terrifying power of the trauma she had accumulated over 22 years. She sang with the heavy, booming contralto forged by physical abuse, and the rhythmic, aggressive phrasing she had learned while surviving the Chitlin circuit. This created a breathtaking, violent collision of cultures on tape. It was high culture meeting gutter survival. The orchestrations promised a safe, cinematic romance, but Etta's voice delivered the brutal, unvarnished reality of a woman who had fought for her life. This dramatic contrast elevated her music into the realm of high melodrama, creating a sound that was unprecedented in popular music. The absolute zenith of this strategy was recorded in 1960. At Last was originally a sprightly, optimistic swing tune recorded by Glenn Miller and his orchestra in 1941. Riley Hampton radically slowed the tempo, transforming it into a sweeping cinematic ballad. The recording opens with an ascending swoop of violins that sounds like the pristine gates of Hollywood swinging open. But when Etta approaches the microphone, the illusion of a simple fairy tale shatters. She sings the opening phrase, "At last, my love has come along," not with the light, breathless joy of an innocent girl, but with the heavy, exhausted relief of a soldier who has finally survived a horrific war. Her vocal performance on At Last is a masterclass in emotional complexity. She growls, she swoops, and she allows her voice to crack slightly at the edges of the notes. She is projecting a profound vulnerability, yet she maintains an underlying, indestructible strength. To the white mainstream audience buying the record in droves, it was simply the ultimate romantic wedding song. But to anyone who listened closely to the grit in her phrasing, she was not just singing about finding a romantic partner. She was singing about finding a moment of peace after a lifetime of abandonment and exploitation. The genius of Etta James was her ability to smuggle the deep, painful truth of the black female experience directly into the living rooms of white America, disguised beneath a layer of beautiful strings. But the recording studio was not merely a place of artistic triumph. It was a mechanism designed to monetize her actual, real-time suffering. The most harrowing example of this exploitation occurred during the recording of All I Could Do Was Cry. The track was co-written by a young Berry Gordy, who was just beginning to map out the blueprint for what would eventually become the Motown empire. The lyrics of the song describe the agonizing experience of standing in a church, watching the person you love walk down the aisle to marry someone else. For Etta James, this was not a theoretical acting exercise. At the exact time she was scheduled to record the vocal, she was living the narrative of the song. She had been engaged in a passionate, deeply serious relationship with Harvey Fuqua, a prominent singer and producer. But Fuqua had abruptly ended the relationship to marry Gwen Gordy, Berry Gordy's sister. Etta was utterly devastated. The abandonment triggered the deepest, most agonizing wounds of her childhood. She was, once again, the unwanted girl being discarded for someone deemed more acceptable. When Etta stood in the vocal booth at Chess Studios to record, All I Could Do Was Cry. The pain was fresh, bleeding, and entirely unmanageable. Leonard Chess, sitting behind the mixing desk, knew exactly what she was going through. Instead of offering her time to heal, the system recognized a golden opportunity. The recording captures Etta James in the midst of a genuine psychological breakdown. As the song progresses, she abandons the melody entirely. She begins to weep, to scream, and to beg. The heartbreak etched into the vinyl is entirely non-fictional. This is the cold, forensic reality of the music industry that mature audiences must confront. The label took the literal, agonizing destruction of a 22-year-old woman's heart, pressed it onto a piece of plastic, and sold it for $1 a copy. Etta's trauma was their inventory. The public consumed her pain as entertainment, praising the raw emotion of the performance, largely oblivious to the fact that they were listening to a human being drowning in grief. The track was a massive commercial success, further enriching the Chess brothers while doing absolutely nothing to heal the woman who had bled to create it. Yet, as the 1960s progressed, the socio-political climate of America began to boil over. The civil rights movement was demanding radical change, and a new, unapologetic black consciousness was sweeping through the streets. Etta James, always fiercely attuned to the reality of the streets, felt the shift. She began to chafe against the restrictive, elegant gowns and the heavily orchestrated sweetening of her argot ballads. She was a survivor, and survivors do not remain static. By 1965, the polite veneer of crossover pop was beginning to crack, and Etta was ready to unleash the hardened, defiant street fighter she had always kept hidden beneath the strings. She found the perfect accomplice in Sugar Pie DeSanto, a diminutive, fiercely talented R&B singer who possessed a gritty, no-nonsense attitude that perfectly matched Etta's own. Together, They recorded a pair of duets that fundamentally challenged the established parameters of female behavior in popular music. The tracks Do I Make Myself Clear, 1965, and In the Basement, 1966, were a total repudiation of Riley Hampton's elegant orchestrations. There were no cellos here. The music was driven by a heavy, aggressive, staccato horn section and a deep, funk-infused bass line. But the true revolution was in the vocal delivery and the lyrical content. Etta and Sugar Pie were not singing about weeping over a lost man or waiting passively for love. They were projecting an image of total, uncompromising female dominance. They traded verses with a rough, conversational swagger, laying down the law to the men in their lives. They were loud, they were demanding, and they were utterly unapologetic about their desires and their boundaries. This was a radical departure from the prevailing trends of the era. At that exact moment in history, Berry Gordy's Motown Records was dominating the charts by sending groups like the Supremes to charm school, teaching them to walk, talk, and sing with a refined, demure, and non-threatening elegance. Motown was selling the illusion of upper-class black assimilation. Etta James was the complete, terrifying antithesis of the Motown ideal. She was the anti-Diana Ross. When she sang In the Basement, she was actively reclaiming the rough, unpolished reality of working-class black joy. She was celebrating the sweaty, dangerous, and sexually liberated environment of the underground house parties that the crossover industry was trying to pretend did not exist. She proved that a black woman did not have to be softened, sweetened, or victimized to command a microphone. She could stand shoulder to shoulder with the heaviest, most masculine rhythm sections in Chicago and simply outshout them. This mid-60s pivot showcased the astonishing duality of Etta James. She was the only artist in America who could deliver a flawless, weeping jazz standard to a theater of weeping white socialites on a Friday, and then tear the roof off a segregated, mob-run R&B club with a blistering funk track on a Saturday. She had successfully conquered the system, manipulating the machinery of Chess Records to become the most versatile, powerful female vocalist of her generation. But this artistic triumph was a facade obscuring a rapidly decaying foundation. The constant pressure of maintaining this duality, the relentless touring, the unresolved trauma of her mother's abandonment, and the crushing reality of her financial exploitation were forming a lethal psychological cocktail. The money generated by her massive hits was not finding its way into her bank account. It was being absorbed by the paternalistic, controlling financial structure designed by Leonard Chess. Etta was singing like a queen, but she was living like a captive. To numb the terrifying disparity between her public glory and her private despair, she was about to seek refuge in a darkness that would nearly consume her entirely, plunging the Queen of Chess Records into a terrifying decades-long battle for her own soul. The first 5 years of the 1960s saw Etta James achieve everything she had ever dreamed of. She had escaped the novelty records. She had secured the lush orchestration she craved, and she had embedded her voice into the permanent cultural architecture of America. At last would go on to be played at millions of weddings, a testament to her unparalleled ability to project an image of perfect, enduring love. But the cruelest irony of the music industry is that the artist is rarely allowed to consume the medicine they prescribe to the audience. Etta James provided a soundtrack of healing and romance for the world, while her own internal landscape remained a violently contested war zone. The sweetening of her records could only mask the bitterness of her reality for so long. The strings were about to fade out, the spotlight was about to turn harsh, and the real fight for survival was just beginning in the shadows of the Chess Records empire, behind the heavy, soundproofed doors of 2120 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago, the headquarters of Chess Records. A deeply complex and highly destructive power dynamic dictated the lives of the artists who generated its wealth. The tragic trajectory of Etta James through the 1960s requires completely discarding the romanticized, Hollywood mythology that has grown around her time at the label. In 2008, the major motion picture Cadillac Records presented a highly fictionalized, commercially sanitized version of this history. The film heavily implied a passionate, unconsummated romantic and sexual tension between Etta James and the label's co-founder, Leonard Chess. It painted a picture of a tragic, star-crossed love affair between the brilliant black muse and the troubled white executive. This Hollywood narrative is not merely historically inaccurate. It is deeply offensive to the reality of the situation. It obscures the true, clinical nature of systemic economic exploitation by wrapping it in the digestible guise of a love story. According to the first-hand accounts of those who were actually in the room, including Leonard's son, Marshall Chess, and legendary producer Gene Barge, the relationship between Leonard Chess and Etta James possessed absolutely no romantic or sexual undertones. The reality was far more psychologically complex and ultimately far more damaging. Leonard Chess was not her lover. He was a surrogate father. And he was the architect of a financial prison that locked her in a permanent state of arrested development. To comprehend why this specific dynamic was so catastrophic for Etta, we must return to the defining trauma of her childhood, the absolute absence of her biological father. The ghost of the famous white pool hustler, Minnesota Fats, haunted her entire psychological framework. She had spent her life searching for an authoritative, protective male figure to validate her existence. When she arrived in Chicago, exhausted, exploited, and traumatized by the Chitlin circuit, Leonard Chess stepped directly into that massive emotional void. Leonard was a tough Jewish immigrant who ran his record label like a street-level boss. He was loud, profane, authoritarian, and fiercely protective of his artists when dealing with the outside world. He offered Etta something she had never experienced in her chaotic life, a safety net. But in the mid-century independent record business, a safety net was never a gift. It was a web. Chess Records, like almost all independent rhythm and blues labels of the era, did not operate on the standard, transparent corporate models we understand today. They did not issue regular, itemized royalty statements. They did not invite artists into the boardroom to discuss mechanical percentages or publishing splits. The entire financial architecture of the company was built on a system of paternalistic dependence. The mechanism worked like this. The artists were kept entirely in the dark regarding the actual sales figures of their records. When a song like At Last or All I Could Do Was Cry sold hundreds of thousands of copies, generating massive capital, the artist did not receive a corresponding check. Instead, the label operated on a cash-from-the-drawer system. If an artist needed to pay their rent, buy groceries, or purchase a stage suit, they had to physically go to Leonard Chess and ask for the money. Leonard would reach into his desk, hand over a wad of cash, and play the role of the generous, benevolent patriarch taking care of his family. When an artist scored a major hit, Leonard might buy them a brand new Cadillac. If they got into legal trouble, Leonard would dispatch the company lawyers and pay their bail. If they fell sick or needed a stint in a rehabilitation clinic, Leonard covered the hospital bills. To the outside observer, and often to the artists themselves, this looked like profound generosity. It looked like love. In reality, it was a ruthless, airtight mechanism of financial control. Every single dollar handed across that desk, every Cadillac, every legal fee, and every hospital bill was quietly, meticulously recorded in the company ledgers as a cash advance. These advances were then recouped against the artist's royalties. Furthermore, the label routinely charged the artists for the costs of studio time, session musicians, and promotional expenses. The psychological brilliance of this system was its cruelty. It infantilized the artists. By forcing grown men and women to beg for their own money to cover basic living expenses, the label ensured they never developed financial independence. They were stripped of their autonomy. The system weaponized their gratitude. How could an artist sue the man who just bailed them out of jail or bought them a luxury car? This paternalistic control was especially effective against the older generation of Southern bluesmen. Titans like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf had been born into the horrific, violent poverty of the Mississippi Delta sharecropping system. To them, Leonard Chess, who at least paid them in cash and treated them with a rough, familial affection, was a massive step up from a white Southern plantation owner. They accepted the financial discrepancies as the inevitable cost of doing business in a white man's world. They kept their heads down, played their gigs, and rarely challenged the bookkeeping, but Etta James was not a Southern sharecropper. She was a street-smart, fiercely intelligent, deeply cynical woman raised on the unforgiving streets of Los Angeles and San Francisco. She had run with juvenile gangs. She had survived the predators of the Chitlin Circuit. She did not possess the ingrained, generational submission of the older bluesmen. She possessed rage, and she possessed a terrifying, explosive willingness to unleash it. Etta James was the anomaly at Chess Records. As the label's undisputed matriarch, she was the only artist of her stature who actively, violently rebelled against the paternal cage. She fundamentally understood that she was the golden goose. She knew her records were crossing over to the white pop market and generating astronomical revenue that the traditional blues records could not match. And when she realized she was being starved of her rightful earnings, she did not suffer in silence. Her confrontations with the Chess brothers are legendary within the industry. Etta would frequently storm into the headquarters at 2120 South Michigan Avenue like a hurricane. She did not make polite inquiries with the accountants. She would kick open the doors of the executive offices, unleashing a torrent of profanity that could make a seasoned sailor blush. She would scream directly into the faces of Leonard and Phil Chess, demanding her money. She was known to sweep the contents of their desks onto the floor, threatening physical violence, refusing to leave the building until she was handed a thick envelope of cash. These confrontations were spectacular displays of raw, uncompromising defiance. The Chess brothers, men who regularly dealt with mobsters, corrupt radio DJs, and hardened criminals, were genuinely intimidated by the sheer, unhinged ferocity of Etta James. They would usually capitulate, handing over the cash just to get her out of the office and calm the situation down. However, the devastating tragedy of Etta's rebellion was that it was ultimately a tactical victory, but a strategic defeat. She won the battles for the envelopes of cash, but she was entirely unequipped to fight the war over copyright law. She could scream for $1,000 to pay her rent, but she did not have the legal education or the representation to demand the return of her publishing rights. The label still owned her master recordings. They still controlled the invisible ledgers. Every time she fought them for a cash payout, they simply added it to her phantom debt. The psychological toll of this realization was agonizing. Etta was smart enough to know she was being robbed, but she was legally and structurally powerless to stop it. She was trapped in a toxic, abusive cycle with Leonard Chess. She hated him for exploiting her, yet she desperately needed his approval and his protection to survive the chaos of her own life. He was the father figure who rescued her from the streets, and he was the warden who kept her in a state of permanent financial servitude. This unbearable cognitive dissonance, being a universally adored superstar who had to scream and break furniture just to get her own money, began to crack her psychological foundation. The elegant gowns, the soaring string arrangements, and the standing ovations were in stark, horrifying contrast to the reality that she owned absolutely nothing. She was a tenant in her own career. The anger she used as a shield was exhausting to maintain. The adrenaline of the fights in the Chess offices would inevitably wear off, leaving her with the cold, hollow realization of her captivity. The trauma of her childhood, compounded by the systemic theft of her adulthood, created a pain so loud and so relentless that she could no longer drown it out with music alone. She needed an escape hatch. She needed something that could silence the rage, numb the betrayal, and provide a temporary illusion of peace. As the mid-1960s approached, the golden era of her crossover success began to curdle. The system had successfully extracted her brilliance, packaged it, and sold it to the world, leaving her with the empty husk of her own fame. In the dark, lonely spaces between the grueling tour dates and the explosive boardroom fights, Etta James was about to make a desperate, fatal pivot. She was about to turn away from the abusive men in suits and seek solace in a chemical embrace that would plunge her into an entirely different, far more lethal kind of prison. The brutality of the music industry is rarely found in spectacular acts of violence. It is found in the quiet, methodical signing of contracts. The tragedy of Etta James at Chess Records is that her defiance, while legendary and deeply empowering in its raw display, was ultimately absorbed by the system. The machine was designed to withstand a screaming artist, so long as the artist did not bring a forensic accountant. Leonard Chess provided her with the platform to become immortal, but he charged her the price of her autonomy. As she stood at the precipice of the late 1960s, Etta realized that fighting the system head-on was like punching a brick wall. It only bloodied her own hands. Exhausted by the fight, she began to look for a way to stop feeling the pain entirely. The strings of At Last were still playing on the radio, but the woman who sang them was walking directly into a chemical abyss. The descent into severe drug addiction is rarely a sudden plunge. It is usually a slow, methodical retreat from unbearable pain. For Etta James, the mid-1960s marked the point where the psychological architecture she had built to survive her life finally began to collapse under its own weight. The coping mechanisms she had relied on, the explosive rage, the boardroom screaming matches, the tough girl persona, were exhausting. She was fighting a multi-front war. She was fighting Leonard Chess for her rightful earnings. She was fighting a string of violently abusive men for basic physical safety, and she was fighting the lingering, suffocating ghost of her mother's abandonment. The trauma was a constant, deafening noise in her head. She did not seek out heroin to party, nor did she use it to fuel her creative process, as the romanticized myth of the tortured artist often suggests. Etta James sought out heroin because it was an anesthetic. It offered the one thing the music industry explicitly denied her: silence. When the heroin hit her bloodstream, the screaming stopped. The phantom debt at Chess Records no longer mattered. The physical bruises from her romantic partners faded into a warm, detached numbness. But heroin is the ultimate predatory lender. It provides immediate, absolute relief, only to charge an astronomical, life-destroying rate of interest. As the 1960s progressed, Etta's life violently bifurcated into a jarring, schizophrenic duality. On one side of the divide was the consummate, world-class entertainer. When she stepped onto a stage, whether it was the Apollo Theater in Harlem or a high-end jazz club, the muscle memory of her genius took over. She could still command a room, belting out At Last with flawless precision, projecting an image of regal, untouchable glamour. The audiences saw a superstar, but the moment the stage lights went dark, the reality of her addiction violently reasserted itself. The superstar was replaced by a desperate, transient addict engaged in a brutal daily hustle for survival. Because the paternalistic financial structure of Chess Records kept her perpetually starved of liquid cash, she could not simply withdraw her royalties to fund her habit. Instead, she was forced into a life of petty crime. The woman whose voice was defining American rhythm and blues was bouncing from cheap motel to cheap motel, forging prescriptions, running scams, and writing bad checks to street-level dealers. She became a fugitive. Warrants for her arrest began piling up across multiple states. The sheer indignity of her existence during this period is a devastating indictment of the independent music business. She was a global icon whose records were generating massive wealth for the executives sitting in Chicago. Yet she was living the frantic, paranoid life of a street hustler, constantly looking over her shoulder for the police. Leonard Chess, observing his prized asset rapidly deteriorating, attempted to intervene. True to his paternalistic nature, His solution was not to audit her accounts and grant her financial independence. His solution was geographical. In 1967, hoping to physically separate her from the toxic environment and the drug connections she had established in Chicago and Los Angeles, Chess shipped her down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Fame Studios in Muscle Shoals was rapidly becoming a sacred site in the topography of American soul music. The studio was famous for its in-house rhythm section, the Muscle Shoals Rhythm Section, often referred to as the Swampers. These were white, southern studio musicians who possessed an uncanny, deeply ingrained understanding of black funk, soul, and R&B. Sending a volatile, fiercely independent, drug-addicted black woman into the deep, segregated South during the height of the Civil Rights Movement was a massive risk, but the musical chemistry it produced was undeniably brilliant. The Muscle Shoals sessions of 1967 represent a fascinating paradox in Etta James's discography. The primary objective of the sessions was to secure a massive, upbeat commercial radio hit, and the resulting track, Tell Mama, achieved exactly that. Driven by a punchy, staccato horn section and a relentless driving groove, Tell Mama became her highest charting single of the decade. It re-established her commercial dominance, yet Etta James absolutely despised the song. To the record-buying public, Tell Mama sounded like a female empowerment anthem, a woman telling her man to come to her for comfort and strength. But Etta hated the track because it felt like a grotesque, shallow parody of her actual existence. The upbeat, brassy tempo felt completely disconnected from the suffocating darkness of her heroin addiction. More importantly, the lyrics required her to play the role of the strong, nurturing maternal figure. For a woman who had been discarded by her own mother and who was currently incapable of caring for herself, let alone anyone else, singing Tell Mama felt like a fraudulent, exhausting pantomime. She resented being forced to project an image of bulletproof strength while she was actively bleeding to death on the inside. The true historical and emotional weight of the Muscle Shoals sessions lies not in the A-side, but in the B-side, the devastating ballad I'd Rather Go Blind. If Tell Mama was the commercial fiction, I'd Rather Go Blind was the agonizing documentary. The song is a masterpiece of atmospheric grief. It details the soul-crushing experience of watching the person you love walk away with someone else, stating that physical blindness would be preferable to witnessing the betrayal. Etta delivered the vocal with a haunting, restrained devastation, stripping away the heavy orchestration of her earlier Argo hits to reveal the raw, exposed nerve of her sorrow. However, the backstory of I'd Rather Go Blind exposes the most tragic consequence of her lack of financial literacy and her entanglement with the criminal justice system. The foundational lyrics and melody of the song were written by her friend Ellington Jordan while he was sitting in a prison cell. Etta visited him, heard the concept, and helped him finish writing and structuring the track. By all rights of intellectual property, she was the co-author of what would become one of the most covered, highly lucrative standard ballads in the history of soul music. But when the time came to register the copyright, Etta panicked. Her life was a legal minefield. She owed the IRS money. She had outstanding warrants for check fraud. She was terrified that if she put her name on the publishing documents, the government, the courts, or the record label would immediately seize the incoming royalties to pay off her debts and fines. In a desperate, deeply misguided attempt to protect the asset, she decided to list her husband at the time, artist Carter, as the co-writer instead of herself. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The marriage was violently toxic and doomed to fail, but the copyright registration was permanent. I'd Rather Go Blind was subsequently covered by hundreds of artists, from Rod Stewart to Beyoncé, generating millions of dollars in publishing royalties over the ensuing decades. Because of a panicked decision, driven by the systemic pressure of her addiction and legal troubles, Etta James effectively gave away the generational wealth she had authored. She surrendered her intellectual property for free. It is a micro-study in how the trauma of poverty and institutional harassment forces individuals to make short-term survival choices that destroy their long-term economic security. The precarious safety net holding her life together finally snapped in 1969. Leonard Chess, the domineering, exploitative, yet fiercely protective surrogate father figure who had micromanaged her career for a decade, died suddenly of a heart attack. With Leonard gone, the Chess Records empire rapidly crumbled. The company was sold to GRT, General Recorded Tape, a corporate entity that cared nothing for the paternalistic, cash-from-the-drawer family dynamics that had governed the label. Suddenly, Etta was untethered. The executives, who knew how to handle her outbursts, who knew which bail bondsman to call, and who shielded her from the worst consequences of her addiction, were replaced by clinical, corporate accountants. Without the protection of the Chess brothers, Etta was pushed into a terrifying freefall. The early 1970s became a dark, grueling blur of relapses, abusive relationships, and a rapidly escalating criminal record. Her addiction was no longer a secret confined to the whispers of the industry. It was a highly public, legal crisis. She was caught forging prescriptions, writing bad checks, and possessing narcotics. The judicial system, which had been held at bay by Leonard Chess's money, finally caught up with her. This brings us to the harrowing winter of 1974, the darkest, most clinical rock bottom of her career. Facing a series of felony charges that carried a mandatory 10-year prison sentence, Etta was forced by the court into a locked, highly restrictive drug rehabilitation program at the Tarzana Psychiatric Hospital in California. She was effectively a ward of the state, institutionalized and stripped of all personal autonomy. Yet, the music industry is a machine that does not stop for human suffering. Etta was legally bound by contract to deliver another album. The executives did not care that their star artist was locked in an asylum, suffering the physical and psychological hell of acute heroin withdrawal. They demanded product. An arrangement was made with the hospital and the legal authorities. Each day, Etta James was signed out of the psychiatric ward. She was placed in a car, under strict armed guard, and driven directly to a recording studio in Los Angeles to record the album Come a Little Closer. She was closely monitored to ensure she did not flee or secure narcotics. She was led to the microphone, told to sing, and at the end of the session she was placed back in the car and driven back to the locked psychiatric ward to sleep. The resulting album is a grim, deeply uncomfortable artifact of commercial exploitation. The track, Feeling Uneasy, is the sonic documentation of a human being pushed beyond the limits of endurance. When Etta stepped to the microphone to record it, her body was in full revolt. Heroin withdrawal is a violent biological crisis. It causes intense bone pain, fever, nausea, and severe psychological panic. She was too sick to write lyrics. She was too fractured to memorize a melody. The producer simply rolled the tape, and Etta James closed her eyes and began to moan. It was not a calculated vocal technique. The scatting and the guttural, wordless wailing that she delivered over the sparse, dark jazz instrumentation was the literal sound of her nervous system screaming for a chemical it was being denied. It is an excruciating, profoundly naked performance. She was broadcasting her physical agony directly onto the vinyl. The 1974 sessions represent the ultimate, cynical commodification of black trauma. The industry had taken a child, punched her to make her sing, placed her in a financial cage, and now they were literally escorting her from a mental hospital to extract the sound of her suffering before locking her back in a cell. As the 1970s drew to a close, Etta James was a ghost haunting her own legacy. The golden crossover era of Chess Records was dead. Her finances were a ruin. Her body was failing. The industry had taken everything they could squeeze from her. The question was no longer whether she could secure another hit record. The question was whether she would survive the decade. There is a tragic, terrifying symmetry to the life of Etta James up to this point. She began her life crying in the dark, abandoned by the woman who gave her life. 36 years later, she found herself in the exact same position, locked in an institution, crying into a microphone, abandoned by the industry that had profited from her genius. The system had successfully monetized her rage, her heartbreak, and finally, her physical withdrawal. They had treated her as a piece of industrial machinery, running the engine far past the red line, refusing to perform maintenance, and waiting for the inevitable explosion. But the music industry, in all its cynical calculation, critically underestimated the foundational strength of the weapon they had forged. Etta James was broken, addicted, and heavily scarred, but she was not dead. The fire that had sustained her on the Chitlin circuit was still burning beneath the ashes of her addiction. The 1980s were approaching, and the matriarch of R&B was preparing to orchestrate the most astonishing, brutal resurrection in the history of American music. The late 1970s and early 1980s represent the absolute wilderness years for Etta James. The musical landscape of America had undergone a radical, synthesized transformation. The raw, analog grit of Chicago blues and Southern soul had been swept away by the mechanized, four-on-the-floor thump of disco, which was soon followed by the highly polished, visual-centric era of MTV pop. The music industry, eternally obsessed with youth and the next lucrative trend, looked at a middle-aged, heavily scarred, drug-addicted R&B singer and saw a relic. With Chess Records dead and buried, Etta was functionally orphaned by the business. She fulfilled her final obligations with the 1978 album Deep in the Night, a brilliant but commercially overlooked record, and then she effectively vanished into the margins. For nearly a decade, the woman who had bridged the gap between the Chitlin circuit and mainstream pop was relegated to playing small, nostalgic club gigs, fighting a seemingly endless, exhausting trench war against her own biology. The magnitude of Etta James's subsequent accomplishments is only clear when measured against the clinical reality of long-term heroin addiction. Heroin fundamentally rewires the neurological reward system. It paralyzes the brain's ability to naturally produce dopamine. When a long-term user attempts to quit, they do not just face agonizing physical withdrawal. They face a profound, terrifying psychological void. For Etta, getting clean meant she could no longer use a chemical anesthetic to drown out the noise of her past. She had to sit in silence with the ghosts of her childhood. She had to consciously process the trauma of the mother who threw her away, the phantom white father who never claimed her, the physical beatings from her choir master, and the millions of dollars stolen from her by the paternalistic executives in Chicago. The rehabilitation clinics of the 1980s were not the luxury, spa-like retreats of modern celebrity culture. For Etta, rehab was a brutal stripping process. It required tearing down the hardened, aggressive street fighter persona she had spent 40 years constructing. She had to learn how to exist in a predatory world without a shield. It was a slow, non-linear process, punctuated by agonizing relapses. But Etta James was armed with a survival instinct that bordered on the supernatural. She realized that the rage she had carried her entire life, the anger that had fueled her boardroom fights and her stage performances, did not have to be a self-destructive force. If channeled correctly, that rage could be a highly effective fuel for her own salvation. She decided that she refused to die as a cautionary tale. She refused to let the executives, the abusive men, and the drug dealers write the final chapter of her life. By 1988, the impossible had been achieved. At 50 years old, an age when the industry typically discards female vocalists completely, Etta James emerged from the shadows completely clean and sober. She signed a new recording contract and walked into the studio to record the album 7 Year Itch. The title was a wry, knowing nod to her lengthy absence from the mainstream, but the music inside was a revelation. Etta James sober was not a diminished, polite version of her former self. The years of abuse, the cigarettes, the hard living, and the sheer volume of her performances had physically altered her vocal cords. The bright, booming contralto of her youth had lowered into a deep, textured, incredibly rich baritone-leaning growl. It was a voice that possessed a heavy, inescapable gravity. When she sang on 7-Year Itch, she no longer needed to rely on the sheer volume and aggressive attack she used to overpower the Chess Records rhythm sections. Her phrasing had become surgically precise. She had mastered the architecture of silence, learning how to hold a note back, letting the anticipation build before delivering a devastating emotional strike. The industry, expecting a nostalgic, watered-down comeback, was stunned. The album proved that Etta James was not a museum piece. She was a highly active, fully realized artist functioning at the absolute peak of her intellectual and emotional powers. The resurrection of Etta James forced a profound, highly uncomfortable reckoning within the American music establishment. The institutions that had spent decades ignoring the systemic exploitation of black artists were suddenly forced to acknowledge her survival. The late 1980s and the 1990s brought a torrential downpour of long overdue accolades. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1993 and the Blues Hall of Fame in 2001. After decades of being passed over for mainstream awards, she finally won 3 competitive Grammy Awards, recognizing her mastery across jazz, blues, and contemporary soul. But Etta James was not interested in simply smiling, holding a trophy, and playing the role of the grateful, rehabilitated elder stateswoman. She understood that institutional awards were often the industry's way of washing the blood off its own hands. She wanted the truth on the record. In 1995, she co-authored her autobiography, Rage to Survive, with the acclaimed writer David Ritz. The book hit the music industry like a seismic shockwave. Celebrity memoirs of that era were typically highly sanitized, PR-driven exercises in brand management. Etta's book was a forensic, unsparingly brutal indictment of the mid-century music business. She did not gloss over the ugly details to make herself look better. She laid her own flaws, her terrible romantic decisions, and the horrifying depths of her addiction bare for the world to see. But more importantly, she exposed the system. She detailed the exact mechanisms of the cash-from-the-drawer exploitation at Chess Records. She explained how financial illiteracy was weaponized against black artists. She named names. She described the systemic theft of her publishing rights, laying out the tragic, panicked circumstances that led her to give away the copyright to I'd Rather Go Blind. Rage to Survive was not a plea for pity. It was a legal and moral deposition. It allowed the public, perhaps for the first time, to understand the exact mechanics of why so many brilliant pioneers of American music died broke and broken. Etta James used her autobiography to shatter the romanticized mythology of the recording industry, replacing it with cold, hard, socioeconomic reality. The cultural legacy she secured in the final 2 decades of her life fundamentally redefined the parameters of female artistry. Before Etta James, the prevailing archetype for a black female vocalist, heavily promoted by Berry Gordy and the Motown Machine, was built on the concept of assimilation. The Motown girl groups were sent to literal charm schools. They were taught to soften their accents, to move with elegant restraint, and to sing songs of polite, unthreatening heartbreak. They were selling the illusion of safe, middle-class integration to a white pop audience. Etta James was the sledgehammer that shattered that polite illusion. She proved that a woman did not have to be polished, demure, or victimized to command a global audience. While male blues titans like Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters projected their masculine pain through heavily amplified electric guitars, Etta James used her own physical body, her traumatized vocal cords, and her lived experience as her primary instrument. She injected a wild, uncompromising, and highly dangerous feminist perspective into the DNA of rhythm and blues. She sang about female desire, female anger, and female survival with a street-level authenticity that simply could not be manufactured by a corporate songwriter. Her influence became the bedrock upon which the next half-century of female vocalists built their careers. In the 1960s, a young Janis Joplin modeled her entire, gravelly, screaming vocal attack on the early records of Etta James, desperately trying to channel the same ferocious, uninhibited pain. Tina Turner drew heavily from Etta's unapologetic, aggressive stage presence, learning how to physically dominate a band and an audience. Decades later, the lineage remained unbroken. When modern global superstars like Beyoncé, who portrayed Etta in the flawed but highly visible Cadillac Records, and Adele ascended to the throne, they immediately pointed back to Etta. Adele famously stated that Etta James was the absolute blueprint for her career, noting that Etta was the only singer whose pain she completely, unquestionably believed. Etta James created the template for the modern female powerhouse, the woman who does not just sing the song, but bleeds the song, demanding that the audience witness her survival. As the new millennium progressed, the heavy toll of her early life finally began to collect its physical debts. Her body, having endured decades of punishing road tours, violent abuse, and chemical warfare, began to systematically shut down. She battled leukemia, dementia, and a host of other severe complications. Yet, even as her mind began to fracture, the core of who she was remained fiercely intact. She continued to perform until her physical health made it absolutely impossible, sitting in a chair on stage, still capable of unleashing a vocal run that could silence a room. When Etta James passed away on January 20, 2012, at the age of 73, the obituaries rightly focused on her massive cultural impact. They listed the hits, the awards, and the legendary performances. But the true victory of her life was not found in the Billboard charts or the glass cases of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The true victory was that she died on her own terms, in her own home, surrounded by her family, having successfully clawed her way out of a system that was mathematically designed to destroy her. She outlived Leonard Chess. She outlived the gangsters of the Chitlin Circuit. She outlived the heroin. She survived the absolute worst the 20th century American music industry could inflict upon a black woman, and she did it without ever once apologizing for who she was. The historical verdict on Etta James extends far beyond the realm of musicology. Her life is a profound testament to the indestructible nature of the human spirit when it refuses to be commodified. The music industry wanted her voice, but they wanted it separated from her humanity. They wanted to wrap her trauma in sweet strings, sell it for $1, and discard the woman who generated it. But Etta James refused to be a ghost in the machine. She forced the world to look at the ugly, painful reality of her existence. Her enduring legacy is the realization that trauma is not necessarily a death sentence. The rage she felt at being abandoned, beaten, and robbed could have easily consumed her, as it did so many of her contemporaries. Instead, she weaponized that rage. She turned her anger into a shield, and her pain into a globally resonant frequency. Whenever a female artist steps to a microphone today and refuses to smile, refuses to be polite, and chooses instead to unleash the raw, ugly truth of her own survival, she is speaking the language that Etta James invented. The industry tried to buy her soul, but she kept the receipt. The sweetening is gone, the executives are dust, but the ferocious, immortal sound of Etta James remains, a permanent, defiant roar against the silence.